my name's Olivia and I'm from Edge Hill University. And today I'll be presenting my research on whether social class influences investigative decision making in policing. Bit of a tongue twister. So it really comes down to one key idea, which was fairness. We like to think that policing is completely impartial, but the question that I wanted to ask is it really? So, could unconscious biases still be influencing how we interpret situations even if we don't realise it? At its core, the research explored whether individuals are treated differently based on their social class. Policing is built on the idea that everyone should be treated equally under the law, but despite this, there are still concerns from both the public and within policing itself that bias can still affect decision making. Social class is particularly interesting because it's quite a subtle bias. It's not something that's usually stated outright, and it's usually inferred through things like people's jobs, the area they live in, the house they live in, or even something even more subtle, like how a person presents themselves. These small details can shape how we see people, often without us being completely aware of it. So the main question I wanted to ask was, does social class influence investigative decision making? This is important because early decisions like who we see as the victim, how credible someone is, or how risky a situation is, can all shape everything that happens after those decisions. So even small differences at this stage can have a huge impact on the outcome of a case. I think next slide. Oh no, sorry, one more. Back one. Sorry. Thank you. Um, so to test this, I gave participants a domestic abuse scenario and asked them to investigate what decisions they would make. There were two versions of the scenario, and the only difference between them was the social class of the people involved. So as you can see on the left, in one version, the couple were described as living in a large detached house in an affluent area. The husband was a CEO, he had a high earning income, and the wife was described as well educated and she was wearing designer clothing. And then on the left, as you can see, in the other version, the couple lived in a small terraced house in a working class area. The husband was self-employed, he was a labourer, he was relying on universal credit, and his wife was described as having limited qualifications and she was wearing a lot more casual clothing. But even smaller differences were changed. So, for example, in the higher class scenario, they were described as drinking wine, whereas in the lower class scenario, they were described as drinking cider. But aside from those social class indicators, everything else, including the incident, the evidence, the sequence of events, everything else stayed exactly the same. This meant that I could isolate whether social class alone was influencing those decisions. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this slide shows the overall findings. Overall, there was no statistically significant difference in the decisions that were made, which is great. For example, 52 participants in the higher class scenario identified the male as a victim of assault compared to 54% in the lower class scenario. Similarly, 81% versus 74% identified coercive control. So overall, the responses were pretty consistent and people were consistent in their decisions regardless of the social class. This suggests that the structured decision-making frameworks like the National Decision-Making Model, they're effective in supporting fair and consistent outcomes. The National Decision-Making Model obviously encourages officers to base their decisions based on evidence, risk, ethical considerations, rather than personal assumptions. Next slide, please. This is where it got a little bit more interesting. So even though the decisions were the same, the reasoning behind those decisions were quite different. So quantitatively, there was no statistically significant difference, but qualitatively there was. This is where I was extremely grateful that I'd chosen a mixed methods approach. And this is really important because this distinction shows that it's not just about what decisions made, but it's how that decision has been reached. Next slide, please. Thank you. When I looked at how participants had made their decisions, there were some clear patterns that started to emerge. So in the higher class scenario, people were more likely to see the individuals as credible, trustworthy, and their behaviour was often explained in things like stress, grief, or emotional pressure. So the behaviour was kind of excused. Whereas in the lower class scenario, people were more likely to question the credibility and they'd link their behaviour to things like alcohol use and financial struggles. So even though they reached the same outcome, they were interpreting the situation very differently based on the social class, which suggested to me that underlying assumptions were still influencing their thinking, even if it didn't change their final decision. Next slide, please. This matters because policing relies heavily on judgment. Even if the final outcome is fair, the reasoning behind it can influence how evidence is gathered, how people are treated, and how the risk is assessed. And in real world policing, particularly under time pressure, those underlying biases are more likely to start affecting decisions a lot more directly. Next slide, please. In practice, this could influence things like who gets believed in domestic abuse cases, how the risk is assessed, and what cases are prioritised. Even small differences in perception can shape how an investigation develops, particularly, like I mentioned earlier, when things are fast paced or when things are complex. Next slide, please. Based on the findings, my recommendations from this research, they were centred around the need for more awareness of the social class bias within police training. There should be more focus on reflective decision making. Now, what I mean by this is getting officers to think about not just what decision they've made, but how they've come to that decision. I think this type of bias awareness training could really help to reduce the risk of unconscious bias within policing. Next slide, please. In terms of future research, it would be really useful to see whether the same patterns appear in serving police officers. My sample was policing students, so it'd be nice to retest this research with serving police officers, especially in like a real world scenario where you have the time pressure. It would also be interesting to look at, like I said, how these biases show up under pressure and also across different crime types. So to build on this, I'm continuing this research into my master's degree. So I'll be developing the study further based on these recommendations. I'll be looking at how social class bias vary across different crime types from lower level offences to higher level offences. So whether the severity of the offence makes the bias more pronounced. Does the bias become stronger in a more high risk scenario compared to a lower level offence? The aim of the research is to kind of get a clearer understanding of when and how the biases are most likely to influence the decision making in practice. Next slide, please. So just to conclude, the study found no statistically significant difference in the decisions that were made based on the social class, but it did find clear differences in how those decisions were justified. I think the key takeaway from this research is that fair decisions do not always mean unbiased thinking, and recognising that difference is really important if we want to improve fairness and consistency within policing. Next slide, please. Thank you for listening.
That is amazing. Thank you so much, Olivia. And you preempted my question there because I read that you were going on to do the masters. I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about what that next step of the research looks like in terms of sort of trialing this, what the design of those tests might be, if you've got that far.
Yeah, so I'm doing a part-time master's, so I'm currently in the stages of writing my research proposal for this. And I think the way that I'm going to do it is slightly different. So I'm taking on more of a longitudinal approach, and I'm going to look at how social class influences decision making throughout the entire process. So starting at arrest, interview, and then the overall outcome of the case, so charging decisions as well. That's about as far as I've got with the research proposal at the moment, but I think that's the way I'm going to do it.
Yeah, they're always a work in progress anyway, up to the point that you start them. What first got you interested in this area? Where does your interest in social class come from? What did you start in the job before that it came up, or is it something that you sort of came into with that interest?
If I'm perfectly honest, I'm genuinely not too sure. It was one of those in my second year of uni, they were like, start thinking about topics that might interest you. A lot of my friends were going down more of like a practical approach. They were doing things like awareness interventions and things like that. And I thought I kind of wanted to steer away from something else. And a lot of bias is already researched in policing, so racial bias, gender bias, they're all very dense topics, and that's what I found as I was doing my literature review. Whereas social class was quite a sparse area, there's not particularly a lot of research on it. So I kind of wanted to fill that gap, and then it allowed me to take it further into my master's and hopefully a PhD in the future as well.
Okay. Okay. And are you working with forces at the moment, or are you looking for forces to work with to conduct the research?
If possible, then that would be great. Yeah, it'd be really interesting to get like an in-force approach, because all my participants were actually students at the time, and while they might have the intention of joining the police, they obviously aren't currently in the police and don't have the experience, the time pressure, the complexity that serving officers do.
Well, you're in the right place. Okay, we will see what we can do. That sounds like a to-do list for Helen and I to see if we can match you up with somebody. Thank
I
you so
really
much.
appreciate that.
No,
Thank
it's a
you. Thank you.
pleasure. Thank you for sharing your research. I think
Thank you.
something has just come in on the Q&A just in time. All projects at master's level and above can be shared on the College of Policing research map. That is a really good point. Good way to share findings and reach out to forces. So there's a hyperlink in there, Olivia. If you've not seen it, it's in the Q&A to uh, the research map that the college runs. It's a great way to sort of flag your research to forces, and we can help support you with that as well. Absolutely.
That's amazing. Thank you. I'll have a look.